Welcome to the Walled Garden Podcast. Here we nourish the gardens of our minds, one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. So I'm sure that many of you have seen by now the new book on the Stoic block, you might say. It's called Breakfast with Seneca, The Stoic Guide to the Art of Living by David Fideler. Now, we actually have the author of that book, David Fideler, on the show today. We had him in the Walled Garden for a live interview and Q&A section a few weeks ago, and that was an absolute pleasure. David's one of those guests who we booked on the show before I had gotten to know his work fully, and I still haven't gotten to know his work fully, although I can highly recommend his book, Breakfast with Seneca. If you're looking for an extremely practical guide to the wisdom of Seneca and how you can take that wisdom and apply it in your life for a more flourishing existence, you might say, man, he has done such a beautiful job of breaking down Seneca's wisdom for us. And he's a really excellent writer. So I know that you guys are going to love this book. I am going to have a link in the show notes to where you can buy it. But I didn't know much about his work when we booked him in. And so I obviously listened to Breakfast with Seneca and I started looking at his other books. And I was immediately taken aback and thinking, wow, this guy is talking about so many of the things that I want to learn, and found in David somewhat of a kindred spirit, you might say. And so I was very glad to be speaking with David. Some of his other books include Restoring the Soul of the World, Our Living Bond with Nature's Intelligence. He also has a book called Jesus Christ, Son of God, S-U-N, Ancient Cosmology and the Early Christian Symbolism. And a whole bunch of other very interesting books ranging from the practical, philosophical to the esoteric. And so David is a very well-rounded philosopher, a very interesting human being, and a great teacher as well. And you'll see that in this conversation. And so apart from my own rambling about how much we just adored David and having him in the Walled Garden, I will tell you a little bit about him from, I guess, a more career-based standpoint. So David Fideler has worked as a college professor, editor and publisher, and director of a humanities center. He studied ancient Greek philosophy and Mediterranean religions at the University of Pennsylvania and holds a PhD in philosophy. Born in the United States, he currently lives in Sarajevo with his wife and son, and is the editor of the Stoic Insights website. As I said earlier, David is the author of Breakfast with Seneca, A Stoic Guide to the Art of Living, which was actually called, get this, the most companionable of the new Stoic books by the New York Times. Breakfast with Seneca was also voted one of the best nonfiction books of the year by the editors at Amazon.com. So amazing acclaim there for his new book. We want to congratulate him again on releasing this. I really enjoyed it, and as said earlier, I cannot recommend it highly enough that you go out and grab this book and have a read or a listen. But with all that said, here's David Fideler. David, I guess the first thing that I want to say is thanks for coming into the Walled Garden and for coming along on this little adventure with us. It's a real honor to have you here, and I've been listening to your book and got it on Audible, and I've been really, really impressed. It's a really beautiful work, and I feel like you capture the spirit of Seneca really beautifully, and also you certainly pay tribute to the Stoic philosophy very authentically as well, and all of the Stoic philosophy. And so my sense of the book is that you certainly haven't been, well, when I was first going in to listen to the book, I was thinking, is he going to be kind of, just cherry picking these little, pieces of Seneca here and there, and then, here's Seneca's philosophy. But I found that you're going very broad, and then you're pulling it all back together so that we can see the whole picture of Stoicism through Seneca. And I really like that, and I take my hat off to you for being able to accomplish that. And I guess I just wanted to first give you the opportunity, because this is the first time you've been on the Walled Garden podcast. And if you want to just introduce yourself and maybe give a little bit of a background to perhaps how you came to write not Soul Searching with Seneca. That's my podcast. That's on my mind. To write Breakfast with Seneca. So I'll hand it over to you, David.
Well, it's really great to meet you, and thank you for the compliment about the book. So that means a lot to me, coming from a fellow Seneca fan. So I must say the book was a lot of work. I think one of the reasons that no one has written a book on Seneca is that his writings are so voluminous, and they cover hundreds and hundreds of pages. And then he talks about like the same subjects across all of his different works. And so the amount of research that went into the book was really a lot of research, and it was inspired by psychological fear, because I like Seneca and I didn't want to leave out anything important. So I would feel bad if I had done that. And so the first 4 months of working on it, I think I worked on it about full time for 4 months. And what I did was I knew what the main subjects in the book were. And then I went through all of Seneca's writings, and I copied every quotation of his where he's talking about the topics into a database. And then I went through Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus too, so I would have their thoughts for purposes of comparison. So anyways, what inspired me to write the book? I started reading Seneca about 15 years ago, and I really liked Seneca for a variety of reasons. And I always thought I might write a book about his philosophy. So in the end, I did. But the reason I like Seneca is that he has this very unique voice as a Stoic. And when I listen to the words of Seneca, it sounds like he really knows what he's talking about. Which is actually somewhat unique for philosophers, because a lot of philosophy is very theoretical and abstract. And Seneca talks about a lot of very practical human issues like, grief, anxiety, anger, how to contribute to the world, and many, many other topics. So I think that accounts for the fact that there's so much interest in Seneca, because he's actually speaking about real human concerns.
Yeah. Kai, I am going to bring you in.
I just wanted to clarify, just in case anybody's going to hear what David just said in his first statement, when he said, one of the few reasons that nobody's written about Seneca. What David means is in the Stoic contemporary movement, not in the academic realm, because I know, David, that you've been working with like Emily Wilson's book. I know you didn't mean it like that. I just wanted to clarify for purposes that nobody in the Stoic movement has written about Seneca. But
right. Of course, people have written about Seneca, but no one has written a synoptic overview of all of his main ideas. That's what I meant.
Mm. Yeah, just wanted to clarify for our audience before we get mail from people saying, but this person writes about Seneca, this person.
Yeah.
Seneca.
Oh, people have written about Seneca. I mean, there are complete guides to Seneca's writings and things like that. But no one has actually written a book about Seneca's main ideas that covers like so many ideas in any language, as far as I've been able to tell, actually.
I think, especially going back to what I said at the start, I think you actually did a really sophisticated job of bringing his ideas down to the common language as well, and just saying, here's how it applies to your life. Here's how these, sometimes very complex ideas can be very practical. I think that is the mark of somebody who truly knows what they're talking about, is when they can explain ideas in a way that many people can understand them. I love that. And I'm going to take us in a different direction, then I'm going to bring us back to Seneca, because I'm going to duck over to your website here for a second, just so that people know the other sort of interests that you've been exploring throughout your work. When I looked at the book list that you have of the books that you've written on your site, I knew that we would be kindred souls of a sort. And I just thought, I can't wait for this conversation. You've written about Love's Alchemy, poems from the Sufi tradition, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Sun, the ancient cosmology and early Christian symbolism. You've written the Pythagorean source book and library, Restoring the Soul of the World, Our Living Bond with Nature's Intelligence. So these are all extremely interesting topics, and I wonder, where does Seneca fit into that canon of works for you? Because it's quite a broad range that you're dealing with here.
Right. Well, I've been studying ancient philosophy my entire life, and which has been rather long by this point. So when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I started studying ancient philosophy and ancient religions. And I became very interested in the idea of the Logos, and also like Pythagoreanism and Plato, because Plato's thought is really, to a large extent, an outgrowth of Pythagorean thought. And, all these things connect together in different ways. And I suppose that one of the ways that Stoicism comes into it is Stoics were interested in the idea of logos, or rationality in nature as well, in their unique way. As I've gone along and thought about it some more, I think that there are a lot of different ideas about logos in Greek philosophy, and they're a bit different. But there is, some kind of common bond between them. But I guess the other factor would be that for the Stoics, philosophy is a way of life, and it was that for the Pythagoreans as well. So the Pythagoreans were my first philosophical school that I studied in depth, and supposedly, according to the accounts that have come down to us, Pythagoras was the first person to call himself a philosopher or a lover of wisdom, but he was also the first person to define philosophy as a way of life, which is quite a bit different from like modern academic philosophy. But we can see that in the ancient world, and Stoicism obviously is one of the great exemplars of that idea. So, all these things, they connect together in different ways.
Well, I really, everybody who listens to the show will know that as soon as I hear the word logos, I dive in, and I want to know what you think, because I was actually taking my very first class in biblical Greek today for university, and the lecturer put the word logos on the board and said, "What's the definition? Does anybody know the definition of this?" And I was kind of like, is there one definition? Because it's one of the most complicated terms,
Yes.
ever written. And so I wonder, what do you see as the kind of major definitions in that Greek Roman time period, and what do you think is the most sophisticated or appropriate definition that we might use today?
I guess the term that I like to use generally, especially when talking about the Stoics, is rationality or reason. But I like rationality, the idea that rationality is embodied within the universe. And that's pretty standard in terms of looking at logos from a philosophical and cosmological perspective. And Plato would have looked at things in exactly the same way. The word logos, it has many meanings, as you know, and it's equivalent to the Latin word ratio, which means reason as well. But like ratio, logos also means mathematical proportion. So it's a term in Greek mathematics. It means ratio or proportion. And analogia means continued geometrical proportion. For example, like in your finger, like this length is to this length as this length is to that length. So that's like analogia or continued geometrical proportion. And another good translation of logos, I think, is intelligence, although not necessarily conscious intelligence always, because there are different types of intelligence. And then another definition of logos is it's related to oratio, which is like something that you speak or a thought that's held in your mind that you articulate. So there are all these different, it can mean an account as well. So there are all these different meanings of logos.
And so I'm definitely taking that snippet right there to my lecture and saying, get a better definition than word. Because
it doesn't. That's the one thing that logos never means. It never means a word, actually.
and that's the thing, right? That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to go back and study these languages, because it just so enriches. And when that got so heavy so quickly, because I've never heard it put in terms of the ratios. And I wonder if you could talk about, does that relate to Pythagoras and his philosophy as well? Is that the way that he saw it, or?
Probably, yes. Definitely in Plato. The problem with Pythagoras is that certainly that's a very important Pythagorean idea, but we don't have any actual writings from Pythagoras. So it's a lot easier to talk about Pythagorean ideas, which you can find in Plato and other writers from around that time period, than saying that Pythagoras said it. Another term that relates to logos, someone mentioned this to me a few months ago, which I'd never thought of, but another good translation of logos in some situations would be the word structure.
Okay. Yeah. So it all comes back to kind of this idea that we can look around us and kind of peer into the structure, the reason of the universe around us. And to me, just intuitively,
which of course exists within inside us as well.
Of course.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
like the way that I've kind of described this in the past is just think about how, there's an intelligence to this whole structure of your body that keeps on going smaller and smaller and smaller, your body, and then your organs, and then, lower than that, and lower than that, lower than that. And it's when you mentioned the ratio just then, and especially that, this is to that as that is to this, that really clarified a few thoughts in my mind of how we perceive these things. And I wonder if you might talk to us also a little bit about the principle of pneuma, because that's another one that I feel, Seneca even mentions this a lot. And I believe in the Latin, the translation that comes to spirit, right? And I wonder if you could maybe touch on that, because I feel like we always talk about logos in Stoicism, but pneuma was, if I understand it, equally important to their physics. Am I right?
Right. I haven't studied pneuma so much. Of course, pneuma hagion is the Christian term Holy Spirit. Just if you're interested in Greek, but it's pneuma or pneuma. But it's just basically the breath or spirit that permeates the universe. And then they had this theory about tension or tonos, and that apparently logos is present in pneuma, but the more tonos or tension there is, the more it becomes concentrated. So when you end up with, the Stoics would say that there's rationality or intelligence in everything, but not everything is conscious, right? And so really only human beings are conscious. And that's because the tonos or the tension of the pneuma is more intense in human beings. But to be honest, I haven't really studied that very much. So check out what I just said. Take it with a grain of salt. But one thing that I did conclude after studying logos for many, many years is that there was a lot of Platonic influence in Stoicism. And I think actually the idea of the cosmopolis came from the Pythagoreans and Plato. And I have evidence to back that up, but I won't go into that because it would be too obscure. But I think that the Stoics looked at logos more in terms of biological intelligence. And I think that Plato and the Pythagoreans looked at it a bit more mathematically. And so there are these different ideas of logos floating around in the ancient world, and sometimes they overlap. But one thing that I would really highly recommend that you read is Corpus Hermeticum, if you're interested in the logos, like mystical ideas of the logos, because there aren't really any mystical ideas of the logos in Stoicism. They seem to be referring more to like biological intelligence, but there were other schools of thought where the logos was more like a property of consciousness and things like that, and something independent from the world that was the blueprint of all of creation. And that's more like the prologue to the fourth gospel, the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, was with God and was God. But so there's a whole spectrum of ideas about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely going to have to get a recommendation list from you for where I might go to get those kind of mystical ideas, because that seems much more my line of inquiry.
I realized that. That's why I mentioned it to you. So.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess one question I wanted to ask about Seneca, now that you've spent so much time with Seneca, often you might hear the criticism of Seneca that he's a bit of a hypocrite, that, look at him with all this money and all this power. My sense of Seneca was that he had perhaps at times a longer time frame in his mind for what might govern the most wise decision at any one moment, which is why he, as far as I can tell through his writings, he admired somebody like Cato, although he did feel like he was a little bit too quick to I guess, go against the ruling authorities. And whereas I feel as though Seneca perhaps was thinking more long-term, which is why in his letters, he's so glad to be writing these down and for future generations, he's thinking really long and not really keen to just jump up there and say, hey, Nero, you're the worst, and kill me if you will. I wonder what's your sense of the criticism of Seneca as a hypocrite? Do you think that he was? Do you think that he? I don't know. What's your sense of that?
Well, in terms of his wealth, I certainly don't think he was a hypocrite, because he addresses that. He addresses his detractors who called him a hypocrite for being wealthy at the end of his essay on the happy life. And I think that the way that he rebuts them is quite effective in saying that if you do have wealth, I mean, wealth isn't indifferent in Stoicism, but it's actually an advantage that you should prefer to have if you can, because then you can do good things with it and you can use it in a virtuous way. And so that was Seneca's argument, which is like a sound Stoic argument. I used to have this friend in Michigan. I mentioned him in the book. He was extremely wealthy, and he lived next door to me. At the time, he had an engineering company that did like 220 million in sales, and it's like triple that now. But he was totally down to earth, totally unpretentious. I walked over to his house one day and was talking with him, and we had coffee, and it had a very nice view, but it was very rustic inside. And he basically used his wealth to engage in all these social projects. And one of the things that he did, which he was very proud of, justifiably, I would say, is that he developed a program that got 30 people in the local community off of welfare, and then he gave them permanent jobs. And that was something that the government hadn't been able to do. And we were sitting there one day, and I was drinking coffee with him, and he said, David, I think about all of these problems in the world, and the one that I think the most about is how to eliminate poverty. So he's the type of person that Seneca had in mind who could use wealth in a very, very good way. Of course, other people, if they become suddenly wealthy, it overwhelms them psychologically, and they don't have the character to, handle it, and they end up blowing all of it. But, there were other criticisms about Seneca in terms of his relationship with Nero. But the early Stoics said that you should participate in government unless there was something that made it impossible. And according to the stories that have come down to us, Seneca was a senator first under Caligula, and Caligula wanted to kill him because he was jealous of a speech that Seneca gave, according to a story. Then Claudius exiled him on what appeared to be trumped up charges. And then he was called back 8 years later after Agrippina killed her husband Claudius with poison mushrooms and wanted her son Nero to, take power eventually. Actually, she killed her husband after Seneca came back. But she was one of all of these people, Nero, Agrippina, Claudius, Caligula, the way that they would deal with anyone who was a political threat is they would just kill them and have their heads, brought to them, basically. So people say, well, Seneca, how could you work for Nero? Because he was like that. Well, everyone else was like that too. I mean, you could argue that Nero was worse, but if you were going to be in the political sphere, under these, tyrants and autocrats who possessed absolute power, you were putting yourself in a very dangerous position. Another thing too is that in Stoicism, the way that you would judge a person's moral acts, the way that you would analyze a person's acts in terms of like whether they were moral or not depends a lot on the person's intention. And so if Seneca associated with Nero because he just wanted to make a lot of money and he didn't care about anything else, then that would be a moral fault. Now, when Seneca first associated with Nero, Nero was only 11 years old, and Seneca had no idea that Nero would turn out to be the terrible kind of person that he was, or that he ended up becoming. And Seneca obviously was not successful in steering him, in a good way. But you have to look at Nero's parental role models, Agrippina, who killed people and had heads brought to her and wanted to share power with Nero, and, Claudius, her husband who she killed. So, they say that parents affect your character quite a bit. So that might be a case of that. But in any event, if Seneca wanted to, stay on there and do something positive, and maybe sort of like moderate, the negative actions of Nero, then from a Stoic perspective, that would be virtuous. So our information is quite limited, though, because basically we don't have any firsthand reports from people who knew Seneca seriously, or personally rather, that have come down to us. And the so-called Roman histories, which are quite inaccurate, the earliest one was written decades, after Seneca died, and the other one was written well over 100 years. So there's some reason to suspect that you can't take them all literally, because there are a lot of stories that become integrated into those accounts, and we don't have any way of evaluating whether, some of them are true or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean,
that's a problem. That's a problem with ancient philosophy in general. For example, you've undoubtedly heard of like the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius.
Yeah.
And the thing is that a lot of people don't realize when he wrote those books, and actually he probably did very little writing. They're just compilations. And I look at it as he had all this information, and it was basically like all this information in a garbage dumpster, and some of it had value and some of it didn't. But we don't know what the truth. We have to keep in mind that these are just stories. And a lot of these stories were told because people thought that they illuminated the character of the person that they were about, or that they had some kind of moral value like that. But really, if you look at his account of the life of Zeno, there are quite a few contradictions in it. And if you read it like really, really carefully, there are even some, he's referring to some accounts that Zeno didn't even necessarily really have a shipwreck, which is like the big one that he starts off with. But then later on, he starts talking about like 5 different versions. And then the question is, how do you evaluate that? And you have to keep in mind that he wrote this when he lived. It was after the life of Marcus Aurelius. Okay. Which raises some interesting questions, like why didn't he include Epictetus as well? But in any case, that would mean that he's writing about Zeno, and all of these stories are like 500 years old by the time that he's just compiling them together. And one final point that relates to this is that there were no critical histories, or there were no histories in our modern sense written in the ancient world. And the first one dates from the 1400s in the Renaissance. And the reason that was considered to be the first modern historical work is that the author of that was taking a very serious look, a very serious critical look at his sources and trying to make some sense out of them and how accurate they are. So basically, if you're like quoting Diogenes Laertius or a lot of these other sources, you should always say reportedly or according to or something like that, because a lot of them are just for inspirational effect.
I have to say, this is interesting that you're bringing these things up, because I was thinking about asking you about Zeno. Was that story about his life almost like a failed attempt at mythologizing this hero of philosophy or something like that, a story to raise his, but then when you mentioned that a lot of these are kind of, picked out of the dumpster, that makes me think, I think the first time I really realized that when reading Diogenes Laertius was when I read the story of a young philosopher who left his town and then fell asleep in a cave and then came back to the village, like, I don't know, 100 years later or something like that. And he hadn't aged, and everybody in the village was excited to see him. And, wow, he'd gone on this. And that makes sense in a mythological sense of almost the hero's journey into the cave.
Yes.
I don't know. Do you want to comment on that as well?
Well, I think I might have vaguely heard that story, but obviously you're right. That would be mythological in nature. But, people continue to use these stories in the way that they were used in the ancient world as like inspirational stories. And sometimes the interpretations get a little distorted. For example, somehow I'm not sure who came up with this idea that the Stoics taught at the Stoa Poikile, because
even that's not
they
true.
really wanted. They did teach there, but it's because they wanted to bring Stoicism to the people, and because it was like a street philosophy, right? And that like Plato's Academy and the Garden of Epicurus and the Lyceum were separated from the city. Well, they were outside the city gates a little bit, but not too much. But I don't think this, I mean, this interpretation is totally modern. You can't find that in the ancient sources at all. So someone just thought that, making Stoicism as like a street philosophy for the public, it sounded really good. And then this gets repeated, but actually if you do a close reading of Diogenes Laertius on Zeno, he's repeatedly talking about how Zeno was actually antisocial and didn't like being around people. It's hard to entertain this idea of starting Stoicism as a kind of philosophy for the public when the founder is rather antisocial. Well, and doesn't like to be around like more than 2 or 3 people at once.
This is over. But David, I want to ask you one more question about Seneca, and then Kai, if you have any questions, I'd like you to jump in as well. But I want to finish my little section here. I have to ask you about philosophical gardens, seeing as you're the one who brought it up in the email. So, so in terms of Seneca, one thing that I've really found has stuck out to me in his writings, I'm trying to follow these clues as you read it start to finish. He leaves little crumbs every so often. And one of those breadcrumbs is he uses this beautiful analogy of being at sea, wavy, choppy seas, but philosophy is what leads us into safe harbor, and he says that if you're wandering on a path but there's no destination, well, that's just wandering, but there has to be a destination to this path of philosophy. What's your sense? Of course, we can all say, okay, Stoicism, the flourishing existence, living in agreement with nature. Okay, but your sense of Seneca's idea of this safe harbor, the destination on the path of philosophy. What's your sense of that?
Well, I would just give a really standard answer that it was just to become a virtuous human being and develop a good character. And that the byproduct of that would be, eudaimonia or well-being. And the term that I like to use, which Kai likes to use as well, is living a life that's really worth living. And also, part of that would be experiencing feelings of tranquility and joy, which Seneca really speaks a lot about. So I ended the book on that note, on freedom, lasting joy, and tranquility, because those were actually important ideas in Seneca, that there was an end goal towards Stoicism. And it was really one of the really surprising things that I discovered when writing the book and doing the research is basically how much or how close all the Roman Stoics really were. Because, for example, when they talk about freedom, Seneca and Epictetus, they're like right on the same page. They have the same ideas. And so I find that to be very interesting. One thing that I found to be really interesting that I really loved is that I don't think this is something that sort of like a general reader would pick up on. But if you really study what they say, every single one of the Roman Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, say that when you're on your deathbed dying, the proper mental attitude is to be grateful to the universe for the life that you've been given. And Epictetus goes on even further and says that, I want to be grateful for the opportunity I had to attend this festival of life, to study the deep order and beauty of nature, and let me be thinking, speaking, and writing these thoughts as I'm on my deathbed. So I think that's wonderful, because what is the alternative? To be on your deathbed and have a feeling of regret, that you've like mislived your life in some way. So I think that if you are able to reach that point where you're just grateful for the life that you've been given, it would be an indication that you've lived a life that was truly worth living.
And wouldn't you also say that within the Stoic framework, there is no room for regret, even if at the end of your life you feel as though you could have given more, you could have done more with what you were given? even within the framework of Stoicism, there is no room to even be thinking, well, I should have done this or I should have done that, because it's about here and now, right?
Right, because like Seneca, wrote a fair amount about how people worry about the future and also have regrets about the past. And the only time that we really have is the present moment.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't have regrets about the past. You should just always strive to do better.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. And just what a way to go, and that's something that I've found so beautiful about all the Stoic writings is just their insistence that death is this final test. If you can be like this on your deathbed, that's an honorable life. Now, you mentioned to me in an email as we were setting this whole thing up, obviously, that you'd done some research on philosophical gardens. And so I want to ask you, what do you know about philosophical gardens? And on top of that, let's say that there was a group setting up an online, virtual philosophical garden these days. What do you think that would look like? What should it look like if it was going to be true to the spirit of a philosophical garden?
Mm. Well, it should be a nice, beautiful meeting place. That's what I would say. And when I was in my 20s, I wrote this magazine article called The Rose Garden of the Philosophers. And the Rose Garden of the Philosophers, that's an image that comes from alchemy. It was a very big image in alchemy. But then you go back to Greek philosophy and you find it there as well, because when Plato established the academy, the Grove Academus was like a public park, so this was like a typical meeting place for philosophers. They would always meet in these public spaces, not just the Stoics. And but what Plato did was he bought a house with a garden or an orchard next to it. So the school had both a public and a private dimension, which actually I suppose that's true of the walled garden too, isn't it? And then the Epicureans, Epicurus bought a garden right outside of the academy. Actually, it was very close there. And then Cicero later did philosophy in a garden in his one of his villas. I can't remember the exact name of the city, but these philosophical gardens were later inspirational to people in the Renaissance, and so they tried to imitate them. And eventually, you get this formulation in the Renaissance where the villas would have these like formal gardens with geometrically designed and things like that. And the very first ones were designed not actually for growing food, but they were designed to be places of contemplation where people would do philosophy. And so there's a Medici villa in this little town up on the hill outside of Florence called Fiesole. And this was the first Renaissance villa that had a garden attached to it. And Lorenzo the Magnificent used to meet there with the Platonic philosopher Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and famous Renaissance artists like Michelangelo. And, they had this little intellectual discussion circle, just like your group.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool. It's so cool to know the history. And, I think that we should take it upon ourselves, as we are building this garden, to get to know the history of philosophical gardens more so that we can continue to follow in that spirit.
Well, one of the things that you really have in common with this is that I really like all your graphic design. It's very beautiful. And the whole reason of like having these gardens is that you're exposed to the beauty of nature. And when we experience the beauty of nature in some deep way, it helps us to contemplate like larger issues. What does it mean to be alive? And it just basically enhances the human spirit. So compare a philosophical garden or someplace that's very beautiful with a typical academic classroom today, which has like these big, the walls are just, made out of cinder blocks with enamel paint on it, and they have no windows and they have fluorescent lighting overhead. And how could anyone believe that that's actually a good environment for learning something that is important.
Yeah. I'm telling you, I'm thinking back to my lecture today because it was online, and it literally looked like my lecturer was recording it, about to do like a hostage video or something. It was like,
exactly.
It was like just, white, horrifying background, like the camera's on a weird angle, and it's just,
yeah.
But
well, right.
I mean, what you're saying.
You look at a lot of college classrooms and you can't tell them apart from like prisons and detention facilities.
Yeah. Yeah. I've driven past my Texan wife's high school. I know exactly what you're saying. It's quite horrifying, and the fences around it is, that's it. And I think that this is so important, what you're saying, that philosophy, contemplation, theology, and this is I think what I believe religion does way better than any philosophy or group of philosophers have ever done, because you walk into a cathedral and it's a temple to beauty, perfection, virtue, everything that is good. And I even think of my own tradition that I grew up with. Although I'm not a practicing Mormon anymore, what I recognize is that the Mormons do temples better than anyone, I think, because everything in that temple is pure, pristine virtue, nothing else. And you have to be clean when you go in there. And I think there's something beautiful about, and that's certainly a walled garden. They've got these beautiful gardens. And I think that's a place where you can truly connect with what is divine, right?
Right. Well, the word contemplation itself, if you look into the etymology of it, it means the practice of observing the stars from a temple, because the first priests were astronomers. They were interested in keeping human life aligned with the cosmos. And these religious buildings, like you're describing, are meant to evoke our connection with a deeper reality, because they expose us to beauty. And the key idea in Pythagoreanism is that the universe is a cosmos. And the word, this is another Greek word for you, cosmos, because cosmos means beautiful order.
Wow, that's and so not what I learned it was today. I'm learning Greek from you. Okay.
but I think that's very important. That was because that shows that, like in ancient philosophy, the worlds of like fact and value are conjoined. And, originally science and philosophy, they were the same thing. And they would call like science natural philosophy. And it's only like about 200 or 300 years ago that science and philosophy separated. And then when that happened, the worlds of fact and value bifurcated as well. So we now live in a world with a fact value split. And so when scientists study the world, they just want to measure things quantitatively and not take beauty into account. On the other hand, when you look at the work of the greatest physicists of all time, they were always very concerned that they were studying some kind of, cosmic beautiful order, and that their theories would be needed to be beautiful as well. Because when you arrived at, for example, like the mathematical if you had like a mathematical model and it was elegant and beauty, then it was thought as actually revealing the true nature of the cosmos.
That's beautiful. That's such a more, I don't know, because what I learned cosmos was today is the standard definition was like, world, universe,
No, that's not true.
Yeah,
that's not true. I mean, you can translate it as world. I mean, no one, if you translated it that way, you wouldn't be incorrect, but you'd be missing the whole meaning of it, because cosmos means beautiful order, and that's where our word cosmetic comes from. As
okay,
so cosmetics are used to beautify people. So there's this deep aesthetic dimension that's implied by cosmos.
Yeah. Wow. And we wonder why it's so hard to get to the bottom of, the real meanings of some of these words that we use so often today. I get the sense that you're trying to go back as far as you can to the source, right, of these definitions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, look, David, I could continue to ask you many, many, many questions. This has been such a beautiful conversation. It's been amazing. So thank you so much for allowing me to ask you these questions. I want to first see if Kai has any questions, because as one of my co-hosts and co-founders of the Walled Garden, he has certain privileges here. And then anybody else in here at the moment, I'd love for you to think about any questions that you have for David and awesome, Kai.
I just was watching you. It was like you were a hummingbird flitting around, and then David's giving you information. It's like nectar. I just felt like that's how that's how I saw your face. Like literally, it's really like energetic hummingbird staying in this position just to get a little bit more nectar. So I really appreciate.
He's growing flowers in his garden that I am all for.
Well, I have a sense of what Simon likes, actually, and so I want to feed him these ideas that I've studied for many years, and it's just fun for me. And I think it's very important too that we bring back some of these ideas in Stoicism, the importance of beauty and the sublime. And there is a place for the good, the true, and the beautiful in Stoicism. It's not just a Platonic idea. And if we just look at Stoicism in terms of how to address our adversities, or manage our emotions, or things like that has value, but there's so much more to it than that. And so a lot of what's out there I see as kind of like small Stoicism, and all of that is good, but what I'm really interested in is like deep Stoicism, and anything that can help us see the world more deeply and connect us to a deeper level of appreciation for the world and reality.
Well, let me just quickly say to that, David, I've known two people in my life who I definitely know are seeding me information based on what they know that the adventure that they know I'm on, and that's Kai and that's Sharon LaBelle, right? Now, they may never tell me, I know what adventure you're on and I want to seed the right information to you, but I know, like, Sharon is doing it all the time, and she will never say it, but I know she's doing that. And I think that also goes back to Seneca, because one of the things that I love about Seneca is he takes the role of a teacher very seriously. He says you should be aiming perfectly with your words as a teacher so that they hit the mark more often than not. And so that, the student is in the right place to hear it at the right time. And that's what that's the sense that I get from you. And now that you've mentioned, I know what adventure you're on, and I wanted to give you that kind of information. That's a true teacher. That's somebody who knows how to impart wisdom upon people. So I love that. Thank you for coming.
Well, we have similar personalities as well, because I used to write music and translate poetry and stuff like that. So, and I've always been, I can tell that you're really attuned to the aesthetic dimension of life. And I think that's very important, because our world has become so utilitarian. And the only way to combat that, I think, is to really think about what life is about. And it's not just about becoming more productive at something.
Yeah.
And that's where contemplation comes in, and recognizing the value of, beauty to make a life that is worth living, and a life that feels complete as well.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon LaBelle, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.